Yeah, Charles, we were just chatting before we went live. You were listening to my conversation with Chloe Carmichael about censorship and freedom of speech being a mental issue rather than a political issue. I mean, I found that a really refreshing angle.
Yeah, so did I. I mean, I think the way I look at it is that it's the sort of macro part of dealing with emotions of any sort. The idea that if somebody's got a problem, they do need to talk about it. They need to get it off their chest, and it goes back to that so often seen pattern of people having a fallout or having a disagreement simply because one person has not allowed the other to talk. They're immediately trying to sort of fight fire with fire, where actually what should be done is a process of listening. If somebody brings an issue, they've got to be able to get the whole thing out. That is in itself a sort of cathartic process, and it almost doesn't matter what the other person says in response to a certain extent. I mean, okay, it does, but in the first instance, it's just being able to get it out, whatever it is, just get that out. And I think what she was talking about, and I would recommend, obviously, all of your Germ warfare content, but specifically to listen to that, because I think that talks very much to what we're seeing in the space that we occupy. I don't really want to define it any more than that, but in effect, the people who feel that the issues they care about are ones that are affected by what we refer to as censorship. Now, she's talking about censorship, if inflicted by another entity, an organization or whatever, or indeed a culture, but also she's talking about self-censorship, and it's this sense that people have that they are trapped because they see a world around them that they can't understand as being right, and they want to be able to talk about it, but they have got to the point where to do so is more and more and more challenging, because equally on the other side, people are being conditioned to think that anybody that disagrees with this, that, and the other, or has questions to ask about whatever it is, shouldn't be countenanced. So in effect, there's self-censorship on both sides, which is really dangerous. And I think this is, we've talked a lot about how things have changed since 2020, and what we've remarked upon quite a lot is the way that there's been a cooling off of the types of actions, the types of sentiments that were invoked in people in 2020 in particular, when it was very, very obvious that there was a massive loss of liberty. And actually to talk about that to anyone was not controversial. That was an easy thing to do, regardless of what they thought of the justification for it. That's become increasingly difficult to do. And I think what we're seeing is not just people falling away from taking on independent alternative news sources or mainstream news sources, but also this sense of isolation and pent-up frustration, for want of a better word. And as Chloe talks about, that leads into depression and everything else. But the unfortunate consequence is that when these things do come out, the way in which they're expressed are often very aggressive and actually counterproductive. And I think we do see an awful lot of that. And I think it's really regrettable. And I'm not saying so in terms of trying to pin blame on people, but I think it helps us to understand why this is happening.
So I haven't heard the interview yet. I'm sorry about that, but what I'm going to, so hopefully I'm not repeating anything here, but I would go a little bit further than what Charles has just said. The censorship regime that we are experiencing at the moment is not just about the establishment attempting to maintain control of narratives. That's part of it. But following on from what Charles has just said, the fact that people who feel that their voices aren't being heard tend to shout louder, it also drives them to extremes of position. And by that, I don't necessarily mean, to the extremes of political thought. I mean that they become so entrenched in their position because they feel they're not being listened to, that it's not possible anymore to have a conversation. And this is part of it as well. So we're seeing a rise of people being driven further and further apart, finding it impossible to communicate with each other in any sensible way. This is part of the effort to keep control of the narrative, in the sense that, of course, if you're not communicating with each other, then you're not reaching conclusions about what's actually going on. It's a very insidious exercise here. It is absolutely the use of applied psychology for political purposes. And, you know, whenever we whenever we're feeling that, well, this censorship regime is completely unfair, I'm being not able to express myself properly, and my urge then is to shout louder with more extreme language, we're in fact falling into a trap. We've got to absolutely resist calmly and carefully, and be clear in what we're saying, because otherwise, you know, that gulf is never going to be breached.
Her general shtick is more about self-censorship, which is something we often overlook, Mike, because we always talk about, as you say, the censorship regime. It's always a third party. It's somebody else doing the censoring. Self-censorship is a lot. It's similar, but it's in many ways more dangerous, because you don't know when it's happening. That's the problem that she's making, because people, for whatever reason, and this is why she says it's a mental issue or a psychological issue, they become too scared. Let me give you an example. So we had friends over a few nights ago. They were chatting about pregnancy and vaccination, and other people they know who just randomly, you know, died or got sick or something severe. Now, they don't connect any of those dots, right? Now, I find myself thinking, nah, I'm not gonna broach this one, because it's become so sensitive. So that's a form of self-censorship. It frustrates me that I choose not to bring it up, but I don't want to ruin the evening. But 10 years ago, we could have easily spoken about that without ruining the evening.
So what I would say to you is that everybody experiences that. I experience that. I get into a situation with people, and actually they're expressing views that I disagree with so vehemently that I'm sitting thinking, well, how do I actually address this? But if it ends there, if the thought process ends at that point, and you leave that gathering and just don't think about it again, and then the next time you have reached a similar situation, then you failed yourself and you failed the other people. You know, every time, this is just how I approach it. Every time I get into that situation, I'm then thinking about it afterwards. I'm thinking about it quite a lot afterwards. What could I have said? What could I have done in that situation to engage these people in a conversation? And I don't necessarily always come to the right conclusions, because sometimes that results in tricky conversations. But we've got to have these tricky conversations, and so I completely get your point. But we've all found ourselves in these types of situations. The question is, what do we do about it? And we've got to actually work out, you know, continue thinking about it after the actual event, so the next time it happens, you've got something to try. Maybe it doesn't work. But it's like meeting people in the street, though, in a bus queue, or in the waiting for the cashier in the supermarket. Sorry, Charles. Some people still do that. But anyway, you know, the point is, we absolutely have to stop being afraid to engage with people, and you know, be afraid to risk a response, and the response that you get should never be one that you take negatively. It should be one that, okay, so that person's come back at me with that. How do I respond to that? And I may not have an answer at that particular moment in time, but the next time it happens, I will have an answer, because I'll have thought about it. But we got to be always thinking about how we address these issues, and we shouldn't just dismiss them as being, oh, that guy's an idiot, or that woman's an idiot. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be absolutely listening to what they're saying to us, and considering it, and considering our response to it. And that helps us develop our own arguments. It also helps us challenge our own, and we've talked about this before, challenging our own belief systems, because none of us should be so arrogant that we think that we have all the answers.
A point that Chloe was making is the difference between speaking freely and also just being a nice person. Just because you can speak freely, you're not going to run past an old granny on a bus and start swearing at her for no reason, just because you have free speech. I mean, that's just common decency not to do that. But that's the problem that we find ourselves in, is that people are finding that line blurry because, as you say, they're being so propagandized into thinking certain ideological ways that they just cannot think clearly because there's so much fog.
But that applies to us ourselves as well. I mean, the best, possibly the best way to approach it is just to ask questions and
the Socratic method.
Yeah, I suppose you could put it that way, but just ask questions because first of all, I want to know. I can't address what somebody else has said unless I actually know what it is they're saying, and very often I hear words and I think I know what that means, but it's not always the case. To the point that sometimes I do wonder whether the other person's speaking English. But that's actually my problem, not theirs. So I've got to first of all try to understand what is this person actually saying, and that of course is part of the issue. We're all so determined to get our point of view across. We're never actually listening to what the other person's saying, and quite often we actually find we're not so far apart after all.
So what you're saying is people listen to respond rather than listen to understand.
Well, precisely, or they don't listen at all because they just want to ride over the top of somebody else's argument and hope that their argument wins because they shout the loudest or most forcefully. This is never going to result in a good outcome.
And censorship doesn't really work anyway, whether it's top-down imposed or self-censorship, because as Chloe was pointing out, it causes all sorts of other issues, depression, anxiety, whatever, within yourself if you choose not to say something that you otherwise would have.
Yeah, well, I think that's precisely the danger, and well, like I said at the outset, this doesn't have to necessarily have anything to do with controversial topics. This is the same, whatever the issue, whatever is eating somebody up, whether it's well, I think one of the examples she gave was seeing something, or I think you talked about having witnessed something sort of untoward, and what's your moral duty, and this, that, and the other. So, I mean, that's not really an issue of censorship. It's just it's just that feeling that you've got to do what's right, and until you've done that, until you've sort of satisfied your conscience by saying something, then that does have a very destabilizing effect. I think in terms of dealing with people who do appear to have an opinion that is very different, but more than that, they're very sort of deliberate in expressing that and making it clear that there's to be no debate. I mean, I think actually just talking about what we are talking about would be an interesting one. Asking the question about listening to other people, about other points of view, and this, that, and the other, because I think that is something that people really must be able to acknowledge. The way that we've gone in the last 20 years, you've just talked about the conversations that one would be able to have sort of 10 years ago about this, that, and the other. Absolutely. I think people can acknowledge that on both sides, and to talk about it, and again get back to a point of convergence to be able to understand why and what the influences are, I think would be really interesting, and might lead into a sort of softer way of dealing with whatever the actual issue is that you wanted to discuss. And I think, yes, I mean, I would absolutely agree. Asking questions is absolutely the right way to go about it, and especially if it happens to be something that you have, you consider that you have a reasonable amount of knowledge on, because you have actually specifically looked into it. to ask questions in such a way as to demonstrate that you are aware of this, that, and the other. You know, we'll say, what do you think about this particular factor pertaining to this issue? And, you know, I mean, often you'll get to a point where it becomes very clear that actually, despite the strongly held opinion or the incredible conviction from the other party, they won't actually know what it is that you're referring to. And that, again, is a sort of a point of break-in, not to assert your dominance over the conversation, but just to make the point that there is another way of looking at it. And I think that's the first start. I mean, if you're going to go into conversation and imagining that you're going to change somebody's mind 180 degrees in that one go, I think that's incredibly unrealistic, or at least dangerous, actually, because if you can, then what? You know, they jump on the bus home, sit next to somebody else who gives them a different opinion, and that's where they go there. So there are, you know, to a point, you sort of have to have a certain admiration for people who are prepared to stick to what they believe, even in the face of probing and questioning and everything else, because in effect that's sort of how we form strong beliefs. You know, we do believe that we know what we're on about, and it takes a lot to be on the receiving end of that and to get to the point where you think, okay, yeah, all right, so actually what I thought about this, that, and the other, I know I will have to go away and deal with that. That's quite a, you know, that you have to be humble to quite a degree to be able to go and do that. But absolutely, people should. And
here in South Africa, we have a great example of how top-down censorship doesn't work. So I think most of the world knows that we've got this third largest political party singing songs about killing farmers. 100,000 people in a stadium singing "Kill the farmer" or "Kill the boer." Now, I don't think it's a particularly good idea to do that, right? But I also don't think that stopping them from doing that works. And yes, here's a great thing, or a great example of that. So they attempted to, this was taken to court, and the court said, well, you can't say the word "kill" because it's an incitement to violence. So what did they do? They turned around, they sang the same song, but they said "kiss the boer." Now, obviously, we all know that they're taking the piss. They still mean what they were saying. But the point of the censorship is that it just didn't work. And so you have to find a different strategy, because forcing people not to say things is ineffective.
Well, I mean, it can more than that. I mean, it can be a considerable backfire effect. I mean, I think that's probably. I was reminded of the "Let's Go Brandon" thing with Joe Biden. Okay, so slightly different. That wasn't actually censorship, but that was the I can't remember quite how was it. The reporter imagining that that's what she was hearing. Yeah. Anyway. But it's hilarious, and then that in itself gathers its own momentum. So no, I think it's I think, well, I don't know. I mean, to try to put oneself into the mind of somebody who believes that they are trying to control speech for, I mean, you know, what I don't know. I find it very hard to get into that mental zone, actually, and think of a reason why you would think it was a good idea, and also to do the what if, because you know all the censorship apparatus that we talk about, you know, that Mike is particularly strong on the UK column news. At no point can I imagine myself on the other side of the fence being in a room thinking, yes, let's do that. And no, I don't think that the consequences will be X, Y, or Z.
Look, there's a really important aspect of this we got to consider, and that is there are people out there naturally who think that, you know, certain types of speech should never be heard, whether that be criticism of trans rights or criticism of women or criticism of race or religion or whatever it happens to be. That's one thing. But there's the other thing we've got to absolutely consider is, because if we take your example of the South African political party changing the word "kill" to the word "kiss," you've got to consider that there was intention there. There was intention to amplify that message and that the way that they went about amplifying that message was to censor the original message and cause the campaign to start, right? That we've got to consider that any time we see this type of censorship on a particular topic, that it might be just in order to encourage people in that direction, because there's a political agenda at work to drive people. And I think that we are in an information war. The censorship, if people dumb that idea down to the point of view, well, it's only just about stopping me from saying X, Y, or Z. It's not just about that. It's also about trying to encourage you to think certain things, to act certain ways. And we've got to be absolutely aware of that and recognize how to resist it.
I've just gone blank now.
Okay, well, I'll fill the blank, because that is, what you've just said. Again, you can absolutely plot that course, and again, this is something we've talked about quite a lot. But the first of all, the suggestion that, for example, believing that the human body can survive perfectly well without having to receive something that's described as a vaccine, or going further and suggesting that, like any other pharmaceutical or chemical product, there may be an adverse reaction from a vaccine. A vaccine may be harmful. All of those things then get wrapped up into what's called a conspiracy theory, and then that gets slung into the bag marked extremism. And then further along the scale, you have the very definition of terrorism being reworked in order that there doesn't need to be any ideological basis for it, or indeed even a threat of or an action of violence. And then suddenly you're linking the belief that the human body is able to look after itself with terrorism. And that is absolutely extraordinary. But if you want to be able to do exactly what you're describing, to either marginalize or divide, or if it comes to it, apprehend and detain certain people, then all you need to do is describe what the topic areas are, and hey presto, you've got your villains. And that works very effectively. And that in a way is, it's so fascinating to read through either existing or proposed legislation and to just examine the way in which it is a gift, because every single time it's open to interpretation. The definitions of anything are always loose enough that so-and-so doing exactly the same thing can get a slap on the back and a sort of hot tea cake, and the next person ends up in prison.
I remember now what I was going to say. So in the movie Hotel Rwanda, which describes the mainstream narrative now, whether or not it's true is irrelevant, because there is an interesting aspect about free speech that's brought up in the story. And that is the use of terms like cockroach and other terms to avoid being obvious, right? And that could be also part of that free speech mental issue, because that when they're saying things like cockroach, what it's referring to, but they can play dumb and go, no, well, we weren't actually speaking about people. We were talking about insects. And so there's a weird kind of psychology that goes on when you play in the realm of censorship. So it's not a very good idea within the context, for example, of that story to apply censorship to stop people from saying certain words. In the United States, you can't call black people certain things. And you can't do that in South Africa too. But you amplify it, like you're saying earlier, Mike, when you use substitute words or descriptors or something to that effect. And so the whole thing it spirals into something. If you say, quote, the N word, what you're doing is you're making somebody think more about what you're saying.
Yeah, you're causing people to focus on someone's race, and that of course is pushing them in a particular direction. Another example, it's a slightly different kind of example, But if we're talking about censorship, the latest censorship-related issue that we're seeing right across the world at the moment, and this includes the United States, is the idea of age verification, and this is something that began in the United Kingdom. Although, as usual, we're not the first to actually finally get it implemented, although the idea came from us. So the idea is only people over a certain age can access certain types of content. So basically, if you want to access a certain type of content, you've got to provide some kind of identification to prove that you are over that age. Now, in Australia, they've now just taken it to the extreme, where they've said nobody under the age of 16 is allowed to use any social media platforms, except it's not that they're not allowed to use any social media platforms. It's only 6 or 7 of the big platforms. All the platforms where actually children are being groomed by adults are free from this legislation, Roblox being a perfect example of it. But in the UK, the claim was that accessing UK citizens accessing Pornhub had fallen by 70% or 77%, whatever it was. And of course, that claim is made without any consideration of whether people are using VPNs, virtual private networks, or not. Now, the general use of VPNs it's just something that isn't a thing. It's obviously, we see advertising on YouTube for NordVPN and all the other VPN platforms that are using YouTube influencers to try to sell their product, and so people are generally aware of what they are. But mostly, unless they're using it in order to access Netflix or something, a content that isn't available in their particular country, most people haven't bothered to use them until this age verification thing has started to come along. And suddenly we saw, as soon as it was implemented in the UK, this massive rise in the number of people downloading and installing VPN software and so on, because naturally they're wanting to avoid having to provide any kind of identification to various platforms. So the same thing is going to happen in Australia. Teenagers aren't going to stop using social media just because the Australian government says so. They're going to get VPN software. They're going to use a VPN. And they're going to access the platforms as they always did. So here we have a piece of legislation which is claimed to be intended to protect children. It's absolutely demonstrable that it was never intended for that at all, because they're not doing the things that are actually necessary to protect children. And as a result of that, people are starting to use VPNs. So what's the next step? You outlaw the use of VPNs, because if you're saying that at the end of the day, using the internet is no longer acceptable to be anonymous on the internet, then VPNs don't provide that 100%, but they certainly provide a certain degree of anonymity from the particular regime that you happen to be using the internet under. So VPNs are going to be the next target. There's no doubt about that. But my point is here that the rise in the use of VPNs, the creation of the problem, which is then going to require a solution, which is the banning of VPNs, is something that was done to people as a result of a particular aspect of the censorship regime. So we again, they're attempting to use psychology to force people down a certain path, which allows them to then take the next step. It's you've got to, in many ways, respect the way that they do play this game. But we've got to be aware of it and be prepared to at some point find a particular hill to die on.
Notwithstanding the fact that the state has no place in parenting your kids.
Well, I think the state for quite a number of years would disagree with that vehemently. I mean, the state absolutely views parents as being unqualified.
Yes.
Right. I mean, that is a fact. It's been a fact for decades. So, even to the point of the state tells you where you can send which school you can send your children to, unless you're wealthy and you can afford private education. But But in terms of which school your child goes to, it's generally geographically based. You can't sort of say, well, I'm going to send my child 10 miles down the road because more often than not, that's not allowed. So this is absolutely the case that the state views people that consider themselves to be parents as being unqualified. It's one of the reasons that home education is so frowned upon, of course.
I wondered, Mike, if the VPN thing, sorry, Charles, I wonder if the VPN thing also is part of a psyop. I mean, if VPNs are openly being advertised on a platform like YouTube, I mean, Google knows that VPNs are being marketed on their own platform to get around all kinds of censorship.
Well, that's true. No, I wouldn't say. No, actually, I wouldn't say that's true because the censorship that's not quite the way the censorship works. The VPNs are being used now to get around the age verification aspect of it, but the censorship itself, of course, works in the other direction because it's the content producers that are being censored. As a general rule, this is just one aspect of it because the issue here for let's just take the British government as an example. The British government a number of years ago produced a piece of legislation called the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, and one of the things that requires is that internet service providers collect the metadata of people's internet browsing habits. So that means, obviously, with HTTPS being everywhere now, it is not possible for internet service providers to know which specific page on a particular website you went to, but they can know which website you went to. They can know when you went to it, and they can know how long you spent there, and so on. So this metadata is it's massively beneficial for anybody that's wanting to build a profile of a particular internet user, and so internet service providers are required to collect that information. But if you are using a VPN and connecting to a VPN server in Mozambique and you accessing the internet from there, then of course your local internet service provider cannot see or cannot collect that metadata anymore. Now, the use of a VPN is never going to protect your privacy from, if you're using a VPN to access Facebook from a server in a different country, Facebook still sees everything that you do while you're on Facebook's platform. You're logged into Facebook, so they're still collecting all that data. So it's not protecting you. It's not making you anonymous from the site that you're using at the end of the day. But what it does is it pushes the privacy aspect away from the regime that you happen to be sitting in, and so it's beneficial from that point of view. But it's also this is why the British government, the Western governments in general, are becoming more and more concerned about their use, alongside the use of end-to-end encrypted chat applications like WhatsApp or Signal, and alongside the use of fully end-to-end encrypted cloud platforms like Apple's iCloud. That's why the British government attacked Apple in the way that they did and insisted that Apple switches off their encryption on their cloud platform because the intelligence agencies are no longer able to access people's information, people's data online, and they're calling that a massive national security issue. So encryption in general is something that is absolutely under attack by our governments, but it's something which is increasingly necessary because we're living in a world of increasingly sophisticated scammers who want to steal this identity data, which governments are so enthusiastic to collect at the moment. It's going to be a very interesting time over the next few years while we see this play out. But the whole data collection regime needs to be resisted. VPN is a very small part of that, but it's one that I think everybody should be using. And if there's any attempt to take that away, that should be resisted very strongly.
I remember when I was heading to China, Mike, I told you that I installed a few VPNs, and I think one of them was ExpressVPN, if I remember correctly. And you said to me, "Oh, hold on. Do you know who bought ExpressVPN?" And I immediately went and deleted it and deactivated my account. But I mean, that also shows that VPNs themselves can become problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. The same with the Tor network. The Tor network is another example of something which is supposed to provide anonymity. But the agencies, the FBI, the intelligence agencies all have exit nodes for Tor set up so that if your traffic happens to go through one of their exit nodes, then of course everything that you're doing on the internet is seen by them. We shouldn't be naive about the world that we're living in, and we got to be very careful about whose infrastructure we're using, and we've got to also remember that forget about ExpressVPN and the VPN providers themselves. Every piece of network gear that's on the internet is probably connected in some way to Israeli intelligence. So I'm all for getting more and more Huawei kit on the internet because at least it's not going to the Five Eyes countries.
Charles, I rudely interrupted you. It was not rude at all. You were exercising your own freedom of speech. I was only going to go back to the cockroach point, which I think is a really interesting one, and absolutely I agree with what you're saying, because it does enable there to be the sort of creation, or at least the illusion of sort of a little bit of flexibility here and there. But in fact, the thing that cockroach did, if it really did, I mean, okay, we're still on the sort of approved version of events, but that is to dehumanize and to demonize, and okay, in the context of a genocide, obviously the result is death, but in fact we see that with all of these things that we talk about, and the way that's done now is via the labeling process. So I gave an example of suggesting that you might consider something that's described as a vaccine in several different ways, but if you are to consider a vaccine as anything other than a God-given miracle, and you should have 25 of them stuck into yourself every day, then you're an anti-vaxxer, or you very diplomatically, you're vaccine hesitant. But the point is, you get labelled, and immediately that strips away the human element, and that as a trigger. And this is what we see, the way in which people are triggered. So these conversations that we might have that start on something that could be relatively innocuous, and then before you know it, there's been a reference to such and such a topic, and let's say it is vaccines. And if you were to express any sort of questioning or skepticism or whatever, there are a lot of people who would immediately be triggered into thinking, right, I am dealing with an anti-vaxxer. And therefore, they're not looking at you as a person. They're not listening to your opinions. They are simply thinking of the conditioning that they've received upstream. And that is what dictates their response. And that, we have to concede, has been done terribly, terribly effectively. And I think that goes back to the heart of what we're talking about, this idea that free speech should be challenge, and this idea of hate speech, again, it's labeling. Everything has its label, and you're a climate denier, whatever it is, so that you can chuck these things and stick them onto particular people. But also you've got that sort of very, very clear divide of things that must not be talked about or must not be said. So again, it's this sort of conjoining of this wonderful ability to be able to completely demonize, dehumanize, marginalize a bunch of people at the same time, as creating this division in society, and again doing the self-censorship thing, probably on both sides. So continuing to stir conflict and resentment, and again classic sort of divide and rule. I mean, it is very, very obvious. Everything now has a label attached to it, and I think that previously was not the case. People were much more able to express points of view on their own merits without necessarily being lumped in with other people and considered, oh, you're one of those.
I'm not sure I agree with that entirely, because, I mean, people were all, Tory, socialist, we always called each other names. I think it is certainly more extreme than it was. But the other thing I would say about that, Charles, is, of course, people who would be categorized as conspiracy theorists or anti-vaxxers or climate change deniers are not immune from looking at people on the other side of the argument and doing exactly the same thing. This is part of the problem. We got to stop dehumanizing each other, and it's not just all in one direction.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, I wasn't meaning to imply. I was just that those labels are so obviously put out there. But yes, no, that I totally agree. That is exactly it. And I think that's again, that's what we see. But I'd be interested to know if it does sort of work the other way. I mean, I think what we see is, because of this pent up frustration, in as I say, the sort of the space that we occupy and the comments that are made within that environment, because people feel that they are unable to talk to somebody who might have a different view, there are the amount of attacking, sort of, turning inwards and attacking your own is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, there is, more and more and more of it, because there's I don't think there's really any sense of a sort of unified concern now in the way that there was during lockdowns or the vaccine campaigns or any of that sort of thing. And what I will be interested to see is whether, on Wednesday's news, I reported on the debate, which should have been in the House of Commons, but was in Westminster Hall, on the digital ID petition that reached nearly 3 million signatures, which, in terms of petitions, it is very, very significant. And, it'd be interesting to see now whether people do coalesce to a greater degree around digital ID, because it seems that this finally has been grasped. Sort of, I don't like to consider that we are lower down in a hierarchy, but effectively sort of further up the chain, in that there are now a substantial number of members of parliament in the UK who are campaigning against something that the Labour government is putting out. Whether people will feel that there is a sense of shared belief on this, and a degree of unity and concentrated focus, I don't know. But certainly without that, the attacking people who are supposed to be on your side has really, really become, I think, a bigger and bigger problem.
So I would agree with that as well, but I would say that we've always had that to a certain degree, and part of it is because people are so unclear about what to do about some of these big issues. They just want to strike out at somebody, and so they will strike out at the easiest target, which is the people that they are closest associated with, and that's part of it. There's no doubt that's part of it. It's just something that unfortunately we have to live with. But I would encourage people to target the people that are actually doing them harm, rather than people that they happen to disagree with at this particular moment in time.
I don't know how to phrase this, but I think this notion of labels that you're referring to, Charles, I think it has a practical application. Like, somebody who's working in my garden is a gardener. I mean, that's a fairly pragmatic label, and it doesn't require any ideological sway. However, I mean, I got a message on WhatsApp from, I say a friend, because I've known him for so long. He's a cartoonist, South African cartoonist who lives in the UK now, but he openly calls himself an old school lefty, socialist. He loves labels. And I mean, he sent me a message a few days ago saying that he thinks more people would take my show seriously if I were not an ultra right winger. And I have spent so long trying to dismantle this notion of left right dichotomy. It's non-existent. Nobody can define it. It doesn't have a universal understanding. You take each issue on its merit, and I've had the best conversations with people right across whatever political spectrum there is, because I'm trying to understand and trying to find rapport and, of course, learn. And I said to him, but what is the goal? What is your goal? What is your end game here when you say something like that? Do you think I'm going to turn around and say to you, yes, well, that's a good point? No, because I don't agree with it. I don't understand what the purpose of saying that is. All it's doing is that it's creating division, which is precisely what you were saying, Mike.
Yeah, it is, and it's extremely, it shuts the conversation down right there.
Yeah.
So there can be no conversation had when somebody hurls these kinds of accusations, and the thing is, if you'd gone back to that guy and said, you asked him what his goal was in making that statement, but actually I would go further. I'd ask him, well, what is it that you're trying to achieve in life? What is it that you are actually wanting to produce at the end of the day? You're calling yourself left wing, you're calling yourself socialist. What are your end goals? What kind of world are you wanting to see? And actually start there and see, actually, are your views that far apart after all? I mean, you might disagree about how you get to that point. You might disagree about the various structures that are set up in order to achieve a certain goal. But do we agree on what the goals are at the end of the day? If we take away all the cruft and get to the actual basics of things, do we agree in the final destination or not? And most of these disagreements, ideological disagreements, are fake, as we have all said multiple times. The average socialist is talking about unfairnesses in society. They're talking about elites being disproportionately wealthy and this kind of stuff. The majority of people that consider themselves to be on the right of politics are experiencing the same kinds of oppressions, actually, from increasingly from the billionaire class and it's soon to be the trillionaire class now that Elon Musk has broken through that particular glass ceiling. So actually, at the end of the day, as we've said many times, we have a common, in inverted commas, enemy. In the sense that people that are at that level of society look on the average man in the street and consider them to be not worth very much. So if we have that common enemy, it seems that we shouldn't be fighting with each other. I mean, it's just we've said it before. It just seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I've known him this particular. I mean, he's just a symptom of a larger talking point. But I mean, I've known him for 15 years, and he hasn't changed his views on pretty much anything. And so if I respond by saying, well, what is your goal here? He just goes, well, that's something that a typical right-winger would say. so it's just circular. So there's no point.
Yeah, because he doesn't want to answer the question.
Yeah, exactly right. But as I said, he is a symptom of something bigger. And I suspect that we just have to continue doing what we're doing and circling back to the beginning of the conversation, not actually censoring and only deciding when, how did Chloe say it? Be decent also. You don't have to be antagonistic for the sake of free speech.
No, that's absolutely right. I'm going to say, Jerm, I have not agreed with every interview that you've done. Let me tell you, but would I even consider asking you not to do them? No, because I just don't get this, why people are afraid of hearing views that they don't like, and why people are afraid of challenging their own positions on things. So that's why I'm enthusiastic about everything that you do and everything that most people do, actually. I don't even know where to go from there.
Just to be clear, I also don't agree with a lot of my own interviews.
And this is good. This is great. This is great. This is how it should be.
It's absolutely how it should be. And I think to go to the point about decency, that is a very, very important one, because for anyone to imagine that free speech should be the suggestion that everybody just has carte blanche to be rude and say stuff that's just unpleasant, willfully unpleasant, it's still rude or willfully unpleasant. That's not that I mean, you're not going to do yourself any favors if that's how you choose to sort of exercise your free speech. The problem, of course, comes when people are supposed to be suppressed or stopped from giving considered points of view that some people might find difficult to listen to. That just being plain offensive to people will always be pointless. It does not help. And allowing, if you're allowing yourself to fall into that trap, then that's, well, it's just not going to do you any favors, or indeed the particular issue that you might think you're talking about. And I think it's very simplistic, but going back to the play the ball and not the man, and again, this is the thing, simply attacking people, even if there is a sort of an undertone of an issue at hand, but attacking the person, again, it's not decent, it's not sensible, it's not constructive. Whereas,
am I allowed to challenge you on that?
No.
Because the reason I say that is, there are times I feel that actually we should be not playing the ball, we should be playing the man. I mean, let's play Tony Blair, for example, and say, this man, I'm going to say that I believe that man is a war criminal, and that man therefore should be going through some form of due process.
But you're not. You're not attacking the man. You're attacking his actions.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. If that's what you're. Yeah. Okay.
Well, otherwise, because otherwise, if you're then just going to, despite the fact
I get what you're saying, Charles. In other words, attacking Tony Blair would be like, he's just a fat slob. I mean, that's got nothing to do with his actions.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But no, I think. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So there's a good clarification. Absolutely. But again, it's to the same point. I mean, and I think this is always, if attacks in any way or anything is going to be thrown at an individual, it is completely unfair, below the belt, and without common decency to attack somebody for something that they can't do anything about. Tony Blair didn't have to be a war criminal. If he turned out to be extraordinarily fat and there was some reason for that he found it very hard to control, to attack him for being fat is, I would say, short of, the mark. Okay, he's not fat, but you see my point, and so therefore, yes, I think to describe him as a war criminal, even if he's not convicted as such, is completely legitimate, because that expresses a whole load of other things. But I mean, I think I'm really talking about within the environment of people that you know yourself. I don't think any of us knows Tony Blair, luckily.
Hope not.
Yeah.
No.
So yeah, that's really what I mean.
Yeah.
I'm going to, if it's okay with you, cut this conversation a few minutes short because we started a few minutes late, Mike. But I'm going to put you both on the spot.
Oh, good.
Next week is our last banter for this year. So,
by the way, I'm not wearing a Christmas jumper. I'm not.
So
First
I'm
of all,
putting
I
you on
don't
the
have
spot.
one.
You need something
you've got a week's
Christmassy
notice,
or something
Mike. I mean, come on.
celebratory or something festive-y. You can
Very
be the
clever
Grinch,
ploy.
Mike.
Don't forget that Mike can stop this broadcast from going out, Jerm.
But I've got the recording.
Okay, touche. Yeah, all right.
What's
all
that?
right.
I'm reminded of that
Okay.
scene from The Wedding Singer with Adam Sandler. He says, well, I've got the microphone and you don't, so you'll listen to every word I have to say. I love that line.
Yeah.
So
It's a very good way to finish a free speech conversation.
bring something festive-y so that it's a little bit different to every other conversation, and we'll do a recap of the year.
Yes.
Highlights
okay.
and lowlights and that kind of thing. I'm just saying it now so that we are
that we all
accountable to
remember.
that. Yes.
Now, just so as we understand everything here, you understand that forever, our final UK column news of the year is always a recap of the year and a look into next year. So we're going to have to find stuff other than what we're doing for the UK column
Perfect.
news program.
Well,
Perfect.
that's fine. And also, I think we can, okay, we haven't been doing these banter sessions for quite a year, but we can go back and think about some of the themes that we've talked about. What's gone well, what hasn't, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think there's plenty
brilliant.
of scope
Okay,
there.
we'll have fun with it.
And
And
I
it
can
won't be a
promise you now,
jumper.
it's all the more fun when Mike does it in a Santa hat. I've got one right here. Mine's waiting.
Okay.
All right, gentlemen.
Okay,
Catch
then.
you next week.
Right, yeah.